All right, so yeah, we'll go ahead and get started. As I said, my name is Shei Shambore. I will be taking you on this webinar here, showing you what's new in Keyshot 8. Now, just, by way of housekeeping, we'll introduce a couple of things. First off, everyone is muted, and so if you won't be able to speak on the audio, so that way it's not there's no interference. If you'd like to ask a question, there should be a questions panel in the GoToWebinar pane. You might have to click on a tiny red arrow at the right-hand side of your screen to pull it out. But you can type in any questions in there, and that will come to me and my team over here, and we will take a look at those questions and either answer them live on air today during the Q&A at the end of the webinar, or we'll follow up with whoever asked the question afterwards if the question requires follow-up as well. And then the second thing is that this webinar is recorded, and so we're recording this, and we'll send out a link to all the attendees after the event as well. Yep. All right, so we'll go ahead and dive in, and so just as a general agenda of what we're going to be talking about, we're going to give a quick introduction about boundary systems and who we are. And then next, we're going to dive in and just talk about some of the new Keyshot 8 features. This is definitely not an exhaustive list because the guys at Luxion do an incredible job at packing a whole lot of content into each Keyshot release. And so really, that's why I have the bullet point at the bottom that says "and many others," because there's really a lot of new features, but the three big ones that sort of highlight the release are the cutaway feature, the scattering medium, and also the advanced geometry features as well. And we'll talk about all three of those. And then after that, we'll get into a live demonstration, and we'll then get into some Q&A at the end. All right, so just a very quick word about boundary systems and who we are. We are a product development consulting company. We are headquartered in Cleveland, Ohio, but really we have a nationwide reach and even an international reach, where we help companies with product development challenges, and we find solutions in software that help them meet those needs. And we do that in the area of PLM, PDM, CAD design and consulting, simulation, and one of those design needs in this case is visualization of your product, especially from a marketing perspective, and that's where Keyshot comes into view, right? All right, so when it comes to what's new in Keyshot 8, one of the first new feature that we'll talk about is going to be the cutaway feature, right? And this is something that has been around. The functionality has been, lacking for years in terms of the ability to, you import your CAD model into Keyshot, but you want to maybe take a section view for the, design engineer types, or you want to cut away, the outer shell to show or reveal something on the inside of your model. It, was not so, easy to do that. You always had to prep your model on the CAD side in order to show that inside of Keyshot. Well, now they've added a very easy to use and incredibly fast feature to where you can basically cut away any section of your model with any kind of geometry and sort of highlight or reveal different whatever is underneath an outer covering, for example, right? And so again, this is really fast and easy to use, and it means that you can then start to show some really nice visuals whenever it comes to, for example, revealing any design secrets or any company IP or intelligence that means that your product is a little bit better and faster or cooler than the competition, right? The other thing about the cutaway feature is that you can also customize the capping as well. So in the prior example, the capping of the cutaway feature was just the same as the color of the material of the parent object. In this case here, there is this, colored hatching over here that sort of, simulates a section surface, right? And you could also have, again, multiple cutaways, on the same model as well. And also with the cutaway feature, you can specify which components to cut away in section, like it does over here for the housing, right? And you could specify which components to not cut away because you want to keep the full geometry within view, right? And almost all of these cutaway examples on this screenshot here highlight that particular fact of, you could pick and choose what areas you want to cut away, right? So again, it's very easy and simple to use, and it makes your renders, much more. I guess it conveys much more information in your renders. All right. The next big thing that highlights the Keyshot 8 release is a scattering medium, and really it's a new material type in Keyshot 8 that allows you to simulate basically any particle scattering. So things like fog or smoke or dust in the air, or even sometimes even foam, right? Foam is technically a medium that behaves like a scattering medium, and so you could use the scattering medium material in Keyshot 8 to model those kinds of materials now. And so this can help you visualize, fog, or even visualize beams of light even better. So, for example, in this case here, you could see the spotlight shining down, and again, the fog in the air means that you can visualize that beam of light much better, and it could sort of draw your attention to your product within a scene. And so again, it's one of the powerful new materials that has been added to Keyshot 8, and yeah, it again means that your visuals are much more lifelike and real. And again, as I mentioned earlier, you could also use a scattering medium material to model foam materials, for example. And I believe one or two of these foam materials is included as a sample model inside of the Keyshot 8 material installation. Right. All right. So the next enhancement is going to be the bubbles, and really, I guess the next few enhancements, the next couple slides I'm going to show, they're all in the general category of advanced geometry enhancements, and all of these have to do with geometry in some form or fashion. So the first one here is is the bubbles, and really it's the ability in Keyshot 8 for you to embed bubbles inside of your geometry, right? And so again, in this example here, your geometry comes in from CAD, and in this picture, it's just a donut geometry. There's no holes inside whatsoever, right? But say, for example, you want to simulate, some sort of gel or some resins, right? Those kinds of materials are, pretty difficult to have to model all the different voids and cavities inside of the material, right? But you could easily simulate or show things like that by using the bubbles feature, right? Some of the other things you can also show with it would be, again, for example, some decorative glass, right? That may have some bubbles in it, or some carbonated beverages, right? So yeah, again, especially when it comes to liquids or so, it can be really handy to show that. And so there's a really simple way to generate bubbles inside of a volume, right? And then the light will then bend and reflect off of those, and so it makes your renders much more realistic, and you could start to generate a lot more different kinds of rendered images that way. So for example, in this case with I think it's probably a tumbler of beer or something like that, you could sort of visualize the bubbles coming up from the bottom in this case. The next example when it comes to the advanced geometry enhancement is the Flakes enhancement. And this, again, sort of similar to the bubbles. In this case, you're embedding flakes into your model, right? And so Keyshot is going to create, thousands and thousands of very tiny flakes and embed them inside of the solid, right? So again, you're not modeling these flakes from within your CAD package, right? And the other thing I'll mention about these as well, the flakes and the bubbles, and also the next feature I'm going to talk about, everything here in the advanced geometry is, it's not necessarily a texture, right? Keyshot is not, projecting a texture onto the model and then showing that on the surface, right? Keyshot is actually creating geometry. It's creating all these, thousands and thousands of tiny flakes inside of the rendered model, right? In the case of the bubbles, it's creating those bubbles inside of there. It's not just showing you sort of a visual texture on the model, right? And so again, it's something that that's very powerful, and it's not just a textured image entirely. It's actually generating the geometry in there. And then the next big enhancement when it comes to the advanced geometry subsection of things is the displacement feature as well. And so the displacement is in this case it's where you can displace or push and pull down the surfaces of your model, right? Based on any predefined color mapping that you specify inside of Keyshot, right? And so in these images here on the left-hand side, you have the raw imported geometry from your CAD package into Keyshot, right? And you can sort of see the outer cylinder of that the spring spirals around, right? And then on the right-hand side, you can see the rendered image, especially the cylinder where the spring spirals around. You could see those curls and turns around there, right? So sort of the threading. And you'll notice in this case here, that threading, you can actually see the bumps and ridges, right? And so again, this is one where Keyshot is actually modifying the geometry and creating those bumps and ridges, right? So it's not like, it's not an image-based texture where, when you view it at a glancing angle, it still looks smooth, even though it can give the illusion of bumps. In this case, it's actually pushing up the geometry and creating those bumps. And so you can make tons and tons of really nice renders where you could, again, really convey the image of raised geometry without having to spend a lot of time creating all of that knurling, for example, in your CAD package. And again, it's very realistic, compared to so for example, you could generate things that bump maps would not be able to handle because maybe of the viewing angle or things like that, right? Again, in this case here, the knob on this electronic device, or even in this example as well, where it's sort of like a brainy-like material, but again, you could sort of see very clearly that this object is not perfectly cylindrical, right? You could sort of see the bumps and things around the outlines again. So this is again a really powerful enhancement, and then yeah, it's one of the ones that I know a lot of people have a lot of fun with. I've had a lot of fun playing with it and just figuring out how it works and things like that, right? And again, it expands the realm of the kinds of geometry that you can create with this, right? All right, so some of the other, Keyshot 8 enhancements, because we can't really cover everything in this webinar. Some of those include the spotlight enhancement, and so they've added the ability for you to create a spotlight in a very simple configuration where you can specify, for example, the radius of the light beam, the angle of the cone, and again that specifies how much light is cast. And which in this case you could sort of see from this image here. That's what's casting the light down from the top of the scene. They've also added the ability for an IES light for you to select the axis, and so it's much easier to manipulate and get the light to shine from the direction you want very quickly without having to always rotate and move it around. They've also improved the performance when it comes to liquid interfaces. So this is where, for example, you have liquid in a cup. Historically, with Keyshot 7 and older, you had to sort of model the different surfaces differently. So you had to model, for example, the surfaces where the glass just interacts with the air, right? So where light travels from glass to the air, those would be one set of surfaces. And then, the liquid, where light travels from the air to the liquid is another set of surfaces. And then you'd also have to model the, surfaces where the liquid and the glass touch each other as a third set. And you then assign different refraction indices to all three of those. Well, now in Keyshot 8, they've added the ability for you to just create the glass as one geometry, the liquid as one geometry, without having to split it up into surfaces. And when you pull it into Keyshot 8 and you assign the materials in, Keyshot is able to intelligently understand how to parse out those indices of refraction and things like that, right? So again, it's improving existing functionality and making it much easier to use. And then finally, they also added, the ability to use some image styles as well. And so, and image styles are, essentially a way for you to make some photographic adjustments to the image, right? So maybe you're adjusting things, maybe for example, like contrast, right? You could also do some tone mapping, and so it's really just a way to tweak some of the photographic adjustments of your scene, either prior to or after rendering as well. You could do some, curve control, color adjustments. You could override the background color and apply a front plate image, and tons of different things you can do with the image style feature as well. All right, so at this point, we'll pause here, and we'll switch to a live demonstration of the software and show you what it actually looks like. And just give me a quick second here while I switch screens. All right. So, yep, all right, there we go. And in this case, I want to start off with this guy. Yeah. All right. All right, so first enhancement that will show in this case is going to be the cutaway enhancement. And so in this case, we have, we have our model in here with our assembly, and let's see. So the cutaway material is always going to be assigned to an object. It's a volume. It's assigned to the entire volume. And so I would have to import a new object. In this case, I'll just easily import a cube, right, from the predefined geometry inside of Keyshot. And actually, let me delete that really quickly because I believe my model units are off. Yeah, and again, model units are generally very critical inside of Keyshot, and so I think my model imported a little bit off, and so let's go. Yeah, this should be. We'll do this. We'll do that. Okay. All right. All right. Cool. So I'll go ahead and import cube, and I'll scale this up. I don't know. This looks pretty small right now. Scale this up some more. All right. Yeah. And really, we'll just position our cube wherever we want it to cut through the geometry, right? And in this case here, we will then go ahead and assign the cutaway material to the cube, right? So I'll double click on this here, and really it's within this material dropdown, and there's a section in there for cutaway material. Yep, so cutaway. All right, and so you'll notice our cube sort of disappears, and you're like, well, what's going on? Now in this case, if I, again, I'll go back to that cube and I'll start to move it, and you'll see what happens as I start to move this inside of my model. You'll notice here it starts to cut through my model. So really anything that that cube intersects with gets cut open as basically a sectioned model, right? So I can again continue to move this a little bit more and really position my my cutting plane in the right spot where I want it to be. I think I just wanted to cut a little bit more through these bolts over here, so we'll pull these a little more. Okay, yep, there we go. Yep, I can see through the shank of the bolts. So yes, that's what I want, and yeah, absolutely. All right, and so that's the that's the cutaway feature. So you can position it, again, you can use any object as a cutting object. So I could use a sphere, and that again would mean the shape of my cutting plane would look different. Now in this case here, you'll notice I don't have the inside of the geometry just looks open like that. I don't have any end caps. Over here you can see the inside of the piston, and so in the cutaway material you can specify for the caps if you want no caps, as it currently is right now. Or if you want to inherit the material from the parent geometry, so if you want to inherit caps, so in this case, it's just using the same material of the parent object onto that cutaway face, right? You could also specify if you want to have a flat color, right, as just the color of that face, right? Yeah, and in this case, you could you could choose a default, or you could select from any of the colors in the material library, right? So for example, I could do something like this, right? Or I could even what's it called, modify the color as well from the color picker, right? Yeah. Right, and then finally, I could also cap the cut with a selected material, right? And so in this case here, I will I'll go grab see what material. Maybe I'll go look for my metals. Yeah, maybe I want to do a brushed nickel or something. I can just drag that onto that that node, right? And it then, yeah, it'll then render that with that material as the material for that cutting plane, right? The other thing about the cutaway feature is you could also specify components that it should not cut away as well. And so, say for example, in this case, I want to add an excluded object. So I'll, and I want to specify here that this pin in the middle of my assembly, that piston pin, I can either select in here, or I can select in the model. I can hold control and pick multiple objects, or pick entire subassemblies. I can okay and say, hey, let's not cut through the pin, but let's cut through everything else, right? And so again, you could sort of pick and choose what you want to cut through as well with that cutaway material. So again, it's very simple and easy to use, and you could start to generate some really nice looking cutaways on your models with it, right? All right, so that's this example here. So we'll pause this one here. The next one we'll go over is going to be this guy here with the ball, and this is where we'll look at the geometry displacement features, right? So the first item we'll look at here is going to be the what's it called? Just having I'm just having a brain fart. The geometry displacement, right? So in this case here, if I go ahead and unpause the scene here, you'll notice this is a suede ball that has a lot of tiny hairs, right, on the surface. And this is a model that, yeah, again, if you look from the glancing edges, you'll notice it's not entirely all smooth, right? There's some very tiny raised bumps on the entire edge, right? But if I take this and I go analyze the material, so we will, let me bump this a little bit, go here. All right, so the advanced geometry features are generally pro features, and they're going to be available from the material graph, right, from within Keyshot. And so if I open the material graph here, we'll take a look at what it is in this model here. All right, yeah, so it's basically everything right here. So historically within Keyshot, all you had whenever you had a material in the material graph was just one input, right? And usually it'll apply that material to the surface of the model, right? And then you had labels and others. And so because of this geometry addition here, now they've split it up. And so you have the surface input, and that in that case takes material settings and applies it to the surface of the model. So things like diffuse or textures or things like that. And then the geometry addition there is what manipulates the geometry of the model, right? And so if I disconnect, so if I double click on this displace over here, it specifies the kind of displacement. So I'm just displacing the geometry by pushing and pulling it, right? I can specify how big I want that displacement to be, right? And in this case, I will disconnect that displacement so that way it doesn't, it's no longer going to be active. And in order to run this, I would have to pick on this execute geometry node button, either here or over here as well, right? And the critical thing to note as well is the number of triangles in my scene, right? So right now it's 10.7 million. I'll click on that geometry nodes to execute the operation, right? Keyshot is going to then analyze based on the textures I have. It's going to run through the model. You'll notice now my model edges look much smoother, right? It looks almost like a perfect circle, right? And you'll notice now my triangles are 686,000, right? No longer 10.7 million, right? And so again, this is a case where Keyshot is really changing and pushing and pulling the surfaces of that model in order to match whatever textures you have, and creating, in this case, those hairs. And so that's real geometry that can then influence how the light reflects on your model and things like that, right? And the other thing about this is again, so this is the one feature in Keyshot where it doesn't instantly show you a preview of that because it's a geometry intensive operation. And really, if you kept on, showing a live preview each time, depending on the size of your model and what you're trying to displace, it could take a few seconds or maybe a minute or two to get the displacement to work correctly. And so you always have to pick on this execute geometry node button. And the other thing is they've added this glyph into the real-time view. So that way, if you've changed your displacement settings and the current model does not reflect that, then it shows you here, hey, just click on that button and you could, rerun that geometry nodes execution button and again, recreate those tiny hairs on the surface of the model once again. All right, and yep, close this, and again, you can notice, you'll start to see the hairs on that model start to appear once again. Again, my number of triangles in my scene is back up to 10 million or so, right? And the other thing I'll mention at this point is that this is one of those features that it doesn't necessarily obviate the need for having really good texture maps, but it's something that can be a really good complement to texture maps, and it's something that can work in certain specific cases where texture maps may not necessarily be the best solution, right? All right. So that's, and then we'll switch over to the next model here. Oh, actually, we'll go with this one here. Yeah. And in this example model, oh, I see why. So in this case here, all right, yeah. So in this example model here, there is, this cube in the scene, and there's a lot of stuff going on. I'll actually, show a little bit on this model, and I'll come back and show some stuff, afterwards in a little bit here. So the first thing I'll show is going to be this cube in the middle of my scene over here. So I'll select on that displaced cube. And once again, if I take a look at the material graph over here, these, again, these three corks, right, that are sticking through the sides of the cube, right, and also on the other sides as well. All of these, and plus the scratches on the corks, right, are all using that displacement geometry feature, right? So if I sort of zoom into here and sort of go over here, they're all connected through to this, through this displace to this geometry node, right? And again, in order to get to that displace, you can just right click and there's a new geometry subsection here for bubbles, displace, and flakes. And so in this case here, if I go ahead and disconnect that geometry for a second, and I'll execute the geometry node, it analyzes, and you'll notice in this case, my cube comes as a perfectly smooth object, right? With the brown areas for when the geometry is displaced, right? And so again, this is a case where Keyshot is actually changing the topology of your model. Again, at this point, I have 108,000 triangles versus if I go ahead and connect this here and close this, and let's execute my mesh displacement. All right, yeah, and now in this case, it's 2.5 million triangles, right? And again, you can sort of see how the geometry is pushed up. And so again, just another example of the same kind of feature, right? But I'll pause this scene for now. I'll come back to this later on. The next item I'll show here is going to be the bubbles feature. And let's unpause this. All right, and so in this case for bubbles, we'll select on the liquid in our scene over here, right? And we'll go modify the material of that. We'll go into the material graph, right? And in this case here, to again generate bubbles inside of this liquid, maybe I want to show there's something fizzy about it or something. I can go to my geometry group and select over here bubbles, right? And so if I double click on this, I'll take a look at some of the settings in here. So these settings, I can specify the size of the bubbles, the density, so how many bubbles per square millimeter. If I want to limit to the number of bubbles, and if I also want to vary the size as well, right? So in this case, I will connect this to the geometry, and we'll say let's execute the geometry node, and it comes back and it shows me in this case maybe just 3 bubbles or so. So I know I probably, and again, this is where you could sort of fine tune it. So I could again bump up the density a little bit more. And let's see. Okay, so yeah, there's a lot more. And maybe for liquids, I could also vary the size of my bubbles as well, so that way they're not all perfectly uniform, as no 2 bubbles in a liquid are. Yeah, so that works decently well. And now I probably want to bump down the size a little bit, because those look like really huge bubbles in liquid. And so we'll execute my geometry nodes once again. Okay, and this is starting to look a little more realistic. Maybe down a little bit more. All right, yeah. So this is starting to look a little more realistic here. And again, if I want to, now in this particular case, the the bubbles are showing up black. That is just simply because of my lighting preset. Currently it's set to basic. Because it's a liquid and glass and transparent, I'll need to up my ray balances. And so if I go up to product mode, you'll notice again the bubbles start to show up much clearer, right? And then you could sort of see that, you know, in reflected in the liquid in this case, right? All right. The next example that that will show. So I'll pause this right here. And again, I guess the last thing I'll mention here before jumping off of this is, you know, this is one of those that that allows you to now, you know, create a lot of, you know, gels and resins and things very easily. The other enhancement that's at play here, but we don't actually have time to go through or talk about, is the nested, the liquid interface, right? So in this case here, all I have is, you know, one material for my, one object for my liquid, one object for my glass. I don't have to model the liquid glass interface as a separate object and apply a different index of refraction to that. Really, all I just do is I model just two objects and I make the liquid overlap the glass a teeny bit. And as long as I do that, internally Keyshot will analyze the liquid glass interface and apply the appropriate index of refraction to that interface. And so, should probably also talk about the flakes. Yeah, so we'll come back to this scene over here, and yeah, we'll go ahead and dive into this scene some more. And in this case, I'll also show a couple of things as well. So to do that, I'll open up the geometry editor, or I guess the geometry view, just so I can show you a couple of things. So really, this scene, all it's composed of primarily is, you know, that's my camera, that's one big cube, right? If I go ahead and if I hide that, there's another cube inside of it there, right? And if I go ahead and I hide that second cube, this is my floating cube in the middle with the cork shooting out of it, right? And my spotlight at the top. Right. So really all I have are just two big cubes surrounding my object, right? And so you're sort of wondering, well, I don't see any big cubes in here. Really, you know, it looks like it's empty, right? And that's because both of those cubes are doing something, right? So the first one here is doing the gold flakes, and this is the third kind of geometry enhancement. And again, it's going to be available through the material graph, and this is the third type where you can specify for Keyshot to create some flakes into your scene, right? And so in this, now this is a little different in that for the displace, Keyshot keeps your existing geometry and just displaces certain faces of it, right? For the flakes, Keyshot it'll consume the existing geometry, in this case the cube, and inside of that cube, it'll just generate tons and tons of tiny flakes. And so in this case here, you could see all those tiny gold particles within the scene. All of those are created inside of the cube, and you'll no longer see the cube within your Keyshot scene, right? And so, yeah, so that's one example here. The other example would be, oh, actually, no, yeah, that's pretty much it in this case here. So yeah, so it just consumes the object and, you know, generates those flakes for you, right? And then the next item to highlight in here for this particular scene is going to be the scattering medium, which is the second cube as well. And so again, similar to the flakes, it also consumes the object, or I guess it applies the scattering medium inside of the shape that it's in, not just onto the surfaces on the exterior. And so in this case here, if I, you know, turn on my scattering medium over here, it's just a material type that's specified over here from the material drop-down list, right? And once you select that, you can specify, you know, your transparency distance and also your scattering directionality if you wanted to forward or back scatter, right? And again, that scattering medium now is what creates sort of this, you know, foggy look, which then makes the ray of the spotlight much more visible, right? And so in this case here, if I if I go ahead and temporarily turn off that cube for a second, you'll notice you miss those rays, that cone of light, but you could still see the light reflection on the floor, right? So again, things like these, you know, you can use this to create some really nice looking images and sort of draw some attention to your models, and create some really nice looking product renderings, right? All right, so I believe this is the this is the last I had to show when it comes to some of the Keyshot enhancements, at least from a live demo perspective. So yeah, I guess now we'll switch back to our PowerPoint. So just give me a super quick second. At this point, I guess we'll jump into some questions and answers. And so if you have any questions about any of the Keyshot functionality that I just showed, or any of the other additions, you know, how they work, what they do, and things like that, by all means, you know, feel free to type them into the questions panel of your GoToWebinar screen there, and I'll be able to take a look there and answer some of those. Oh, okay. So one question in here is, let's see, how would I sort of phrase this? So it's basically asking, you know, in the case of the displaced geometry functionality, it increases the number of triangles in one case, you know, up to about 10 million triangles. And so the question is, you know, does that affect how Keyshot runs? To my understanding, the number of triangles in your scene can be a lot, but that doesn't affect Keyshot in terms of when it calculates the light bouncing through your scene and resing up to get you a high quality image. That generally is not dependent on the number of triangles in your scene. The number of triangles will primarily influence, I think, about two things. One is going to be your file size is probably going to be a little bit bigger. And number two is going to be that whenever you open up that model for the first time, the bigger the number of triangles, generally it'll take a little bit longer of a time for Keyshot to open it up versus if it had fewer triangles in it. But again, that's just as soon as you open it up. Once it's open and Keyshot's doing the rendering, there should not be any slowdown in rendering speed. All right. So yeah, I think those are, that's all the questions we have today. So yeah, so not a whole lot of questions. Yeah, and so that's totally fine. We'll move on to so we'll basically conclude the webinar right here. You know, if you have any more questions about Keyshot, you know, the functionality or things like that, you know, my contact information is up on the screen. You could always reach out to me. If you have any questions about, you know, how do we get our hands on Keyshot, you know, pricing or things like that, our sales team is also included on there as well. Yeah, and so thank you so much for attending this week's edition of Boundaries Webinar Wednesdays. I really appreciate your time, and we look forward to having you in a future episode here of Boundaries Webinar Wednesdays. Thanks, and you have a good one. Bye.